favorite things in the entire world is coming up, and that is the Olympics. I don't know, it's just something about watching the Olympics and watching sports that aren't really well featured here in the United States. You know, we get a lot of basketball, football, American football, even some soccer or more traditional football. But we don't get a lot of other sports. They're not as popular here. And it's really interesting to see the history of the Olympics and what they offer, not just to each individual state, but to the world as a whole. I don't know, it's just something about it that really just fascinates me, and I always love cheering on all of the different sports, all the different athletes. I've grown a fan of a lot of these different athletes, especially in sports that aren't as well popularized. I have some other opinions on which athletes should and should not be in the Olympics, but that's a discussion for another day. But I decided it would be super fun if I created a TBR of books that you can read and that I can read during this Olympic season. Hopefully this video is going up at the time of the opening ceremony, and I wanted to break this up into 3 different parts. So I've looked on the Olympics website. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is based directly from the Olympics website. And they have a lot of information there about not just the history of the sport in general, but its history in the Olympics, sometimes who's even won the most medals. And I found that really fascinating. So what I decided to do was create an Olympic TBR. Now, I've done Olympic themed TBRs in the past, especially if you've been here for a while. When I used to do TBR games, I had a lot of different Olympic TBR videos that I would put out, but this one I'm going to do a little bit differently. I did so much research, I spent so much time trying to find books, both fiction and nonfiction, that somehow featured each of the different sports. I was able to find about 39 different fiction and nonfiction books based off the sports. Sometimes I combined some of the categories as they were kind of hard to find, but I thought it'd be really fun to give this out to you guys and give kind of my recommendations either on what I have read and I know features a sport, or what I am planning to read during these next 3 weeks of the Olympics. And I don't know, I just thought it was a lot of fun to kind of research and find out more about what these sports mean to people and how they can be shown and portrayed throughout literature. I am just going to go in essentially alphabetical order of all of the different sports. Again, I kind of mentioned that I might be combining some categories. So while you might see like canoeing slalom versus canoeing sprint as 2 different sports on the Olympic website, I'm going to be combining them as one just because it's kind of hard to find very specific sports. I had to do a lot of research, spent a lot of time trying to actually find books that featured the 39 sports that I'm going to be talking about. And so bear with me. I will mention when the categories are usually split off into 2 separate Olympic sports that can be medaled in. And obviously within each of the categories, there's different medals that you can win. Like for example, swimming has like so many different types of medal opportunities, from like the 100-meter butterfly to the 100-meter freestyle to team events, etc., etc. Same thing with like artistic gymnastics. You know, you can get into the team, or you can get in the all-around, or you can get on the beam and things like that. So while the sport itself has different categories, there are some sports that are technically completely separate from one another. But like I said, I'll make sure that I mention when it actually kind of splits off between the history of the sport, history of the Olympics, and things like that. So because I'm me, I love diving into research, and so I thought it'd be fun to not just give history on the sport itself, but also history of it through the Olympics. All of these quotes that I'm going to be reading to you about each of the sports you can find directly on the Olympics website. Again, it's actually a really useful resource for all things Olympics. So if you are a fan of it, I highly recommend using that website. I'll have a link down below as well, so that way you can utilize it to your advantage. But the first sport we're going to talk about is going to be archery. Archery is one of the oldest sports still practiced today, and is closely linked to the development of human civilization. Historically, archery has been used for hunting and warfare. The earliest evidence of its use comes from South African sites such as Sibadu Cave, where arrowheads dating from approximately 64,000 years ago have been found. The first recorded archery tournaments took place in the People's Republic of China during the Zhou Dynasty, taking place from 1027 to 256 BC. In 1931, the sport evolved around the globe, and the International Archery Federation, now known as World Archery, was founded. Archery first featured at the Olympic Games at Paris in 1900 and was contested again at the Games in St. Louis in 1904, London in 1908, and Antwerp in 1920, before a 52-year hiatus from the Olympic program. Archery was reintroduced at the Games for the 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich and has remained on the Olympic program ever since. The Republic of Korea has been the most successful nation in the sport at the Olympics, winning 27 gold, 9 silver, and 7 bronze medals for a total of 43 medals. Now, this one I wanted to start off a little bit easy because I think one of the most well-known books that features archery or has a character doing archery is going to be The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. I have read this before. I'm actually currently rereading it again for the Olympics. And I think it's really great in featuring the sport of archery, not necessarily as a sport, but more for what it was originally founded for that hunter-gatherer aspect of it. As we know that Katniss uses it as a means of survival, not just before she is in the games, but while she is in the games as well. And then for nonfiction, I have here in my notes, we have Zen in the Art of Archery by Eugene Herrigel, which is basically the author's journey over 6 years to learn about archery through Japanese Zen masters. So if you're interested in a more nonfiction novel outside of the Hunger Games to really learn more about not just the history of archery, but this author's specific journey about finding it through Zen and Japanese masters, which I think is really fascinating, I highly recommend this book. I am so excited to read it. I can't wait to see exactly how this author decides to combine the two forms of art when it comes to Zen and archery. And so this was a very, very popular nonfiction book when I was doing my research for nonfiction books about archery. Next sport, we have artistic gymnastics. And this is essentially the quote-unquote more popular gymnastics. This is where you're going to see your Simone Bileses, your Shawn Johnsons, Nastia Liukin. This is where they performed at the Olympics in artistic gymnastics. Founded in 1881, the International Gymnastics Federation is the oldest international sports federation in the world. The origin of gymnastics dates to antiquity, where it was recommended by philosophers as a way of combining physical exercise with intellectual activity. The sport grew in popularity during the 19th century as increasing number of competitions were formed, including the gymnastics competition at the newly revived Olympic Games in Athens in 1896. Artistic gymnastics was introduced at the very first Olympic Games of the modern era in 1896 and has been included in every edition ever since. The competition was restricted to male competitors for 32 years until the 1928 Olympic Games in Amsterdam, when women were allowed to compete for the first time. It wasn't until 1952 that the women's program was developed with 7 events and then later stabilized at 6 events, as has been the case ever since the 1960 Games in Rome. There are 8 events on the men's program. The Soviet Union has been the most successful nation in the sport at the Olympics, winning 72 gold, 67 silver, and 43 bronze medals, for a total of 182 medals. If you are interested in artistic gymnastics, a great novel that I've heard many great things about that I'm super excited for, I just got it on my Libby, is The Happiest Girl in the World by Elena Dillon. This is a book that features a character who is trying to get that Olympic gold medal and is willing to do whatever it takes, even if that means sacrificing her mental health and her physical health and the well-being of herself in general. I think it really is going to try to portray what we've learned about U.S. gymnastics specifically, and not just with the USA team or Team USA, but also within the college and collegiate experience. I think it's going to really have to focus on that, especially after what has come out in the recent years of Larry Nassar. And I really think that this is going to be a hard story to tell, but I am interested and intrigued, and this seems like a very, very good novel. For nonfiction, I'm going to be a little bit biased, and I'm going to say Chalked Up by Jennifer Say. Jennifer Say is a national champion and has really, in this book, which came out years ago, I think back in like the late 2000s, really tried to draw back the curtain about what it means to be at that competitive and elite level. But I am biased in this because actually my mom knew Jennifer Say and trained with her, and while they weren't like, they were in different age classes, my mom is actually featured in the book for a hot second, and yeah, I think that's super cool. So chalked up for your nonfiction artistic gymnastics pick. Next sport is going to be artistic swimming, which I'm not sure if this is a new name or maybe I just didn't know it was called this, but the artistic swimming is like the fancy way or the new way, or maybe it's always been the traditional way and I just didn't know it, of calling it synchronized. It's synchronized swimming, that's what it is. The sport of artistic swimming developed by combining water aerobics with music. Although the first contests were organized for men, artistic swimming later became more associated with women. After a number of demonstrations in the US in the early 20th century, the discipline grew in popularity and the first competitions were organized. Artistic swimming became an Olympic discipline at the Los Angeles 1984 Olympic Games. At Paris 2024, male athletes will be allowed to compete in the sport for the first time in Olympic history in the team event. The USA and Canada were initially the dominant force in artistic swimming at the Games, combining for 17 medals, including 8 gold medals. Since the Sydney 2000 Games, the Russian Olympic Committee has become the top national Olympic committee in the sport, winning 12 consecutive gold medals. Now, synchronized swimming is just something that I've always just been so fascinated by. I think it looks super cool, and I would love to be able to be a part of it. And so a fiction book that actually features this, because this was kind of hard to find at some points, was We Came Here to Shine by Susie Orman Schnall, I believe is how you pronounce it. And in this book, the main general idea is that it takes place at the 1939 World's Fair in New York, where Vivi and Max will have their lives turned upside down and jobs are at the stake. I believe one of the characters, I want to say Vivi when I was researching this, has to participate in the synchronized swimming display and showcase, because I think she's an actress, or maybe that's Max and she's the actress and she has to pretend like she knows what synchronized swimming is. I don't really know, but it's focusing on synchronized swimming, or at least it plays a part in it, so I can't wait to read that. I think that's super cool, especially because I think the World's Fair is such an interesting concept, and I read that Eric Larson book, I believe that's the author, The Devil in the White City, and that was featuring like a World's Fair, and one time I went to Tennessee in Knoxville, and we went up to like the tower. There was like a tower that was featured at the World's Fair or built for the World's Fair or something like that. So anything with the World's Fair just fascinates me, and so I can't wait to read this book. And if you are interested in a nonfiction selection that focuses on artistic swimming or synchronized swimming, I recommend Catherine Whitney Curtis, Mother of Synchronized Swimming by Jordan Whitney Wade. And this is basically focusing on the life of Catherine Whitney Curtis, as she is known for inventing the sport as we know it today. But this book is going to be focusing much more on her life besides creating and becoming this mother figure of synchronized swimming, so I can't wait to pick this one up as well. Next sport we're going to be focusing on is athletics, and athletics is just another way of saying it's track and field. I think it's called athletics because it was one of the very original sports for the original Olympic Games, but it's also interesting because you're combining a lot of other sports, not just with running, but also throwing, jumping, things like that, hurdles, running through water. I don't know, my college EKU always seems to send someone that's in the steeplechase, which I think involves like hurdles and running through water. I don't know why, they always seem to be representing their home countries, but also my college, so go Colonels. Contested at the very first ancient Olympic Games, athletics is one of the oldest sports on record, with the names of champions documented from as far back as 776 BC. The ancient Olympic Games included events like the pentathlon, which consisted of a running race, long jump, discus throw, javelin throw, and wrestling. The first meets in modern times that can be linked to athletics competitions we know today took place in 1840 in Shropshire, England. Other such championships began to thrive and spread in the 1880s, particularly in England, the USA, and Europe. In 1912, the International Federation that oversees international athletics competitions, the IAAF, known as World Athletics, was established. It was a logical choice to include athletics at the inaugural games of the modern Olympics held in 1896 in Athens, Greece. Its age-old position in the Olympic program makes athletics the crown jewel of the Summer Games. The men's events have remained unchanged since the 1932 Los Angeles Games, save for the addition of the 200-kilometer race walk at the 1956 Melbourne Games. Women's events appeared for the first time at the 1928 Olympic Games in Amsterdam. The women's competition only had 17 events until 1992, but with the incorporation of the 3,000-meter steeplechase in 2008, female athletes now compete in the same number of events as their male counterparts. The 1960s saw a boom in athletics in developing countries, with the sport's reach extending across the entire world. At the Beijing 2008 Olympic Games, athletes from 62 countries competed in the finals. The United States has been the most successful nation in the sport at the Olympics, winning 344 gold, 269 silver, and 214 bronze medals for a total of 827 medals. I think that there's so many books on running out there, but the one fiction book that kept coming up a lot in my research as basically, and this is what it's being pitched as, like one of the best novels about running, is called Once a Runner by John L. Parker Jr. And I didn't want to look much more into that. I didn't want to know too much about the book because I think the fact that so many people have determined it one of the best novels about running piques my interest just enough that I'm like, okay, that's enough. I'll dive into it. I'm curious about it. And of course, there's going to be so many nonfiction books either about running or featuring runners that, because it's just such an accessible sport that so many people can do. The one that I really wanted to focus on here in this video that I am also excited to check out as well is going to be Good for a Girl, A Woman Running in a Man's World by Lauren Fleshman. This book is a biography book and focusing on Lauren Fleshman, who is a very decorated athlete herself in the sport of running and athletics, and it has become, since leaving the sport or not doing it as competitive as she used to be, a very big advocate for women's sports, as women's sports is still something that is not pushed for enough, that is not featured enough, and always seems to get the short end of the stick when it comes to being focused in on other major sporting events, and that goes for both the Olympics and professional events as well. So I'm really curious to hear more about her story and what she is doing for advocacy work. Next, badminton. Badminton is a racket sport whose exact origins are still a tantalizing mystery. It evolved from the older games of battledore and shuttlecock, which were popular pastimes in Europe, particularly among the more affluent classes. However, it is unknown exactly where battledore and shuttlecock transformed into the competitive sport of badminton. One plausible theory is that badminton was played at the stately home of the Duke of Beaufort in Gloucestershire sometime in the early 1860s, and was thus named after his estate, Badminton House. The game traveled to India, where it became a popular sport in military containments and gradually spread across the British colonies and then to Europe and East Asia. Today, badminton is a global sport with widespread appeal among people of all ages and abilities. Badminton made its Olympic debut as a demonstration sport at the 1972 Games in Munich and was included as an exhibition sport at the Seoul 1988 Olympic Games. 4 years later, badminton became an official part of the Olympic program at the 1992 Games in Barcelona with 4 medal categories: men's and women's singles, and men's and women's doubles. Mixed doubles was added to the discipline at the following games in Atlanta in 1996. Athletes representing Asian nations have dominated the podium at the games, accounting for 106 out of the 121 badminton medals in Olympic history, with China being the nation most successful in the sport. At Paris 2024, 172 athletes will compete in the badminton competition. The events of men's and women's singles, men's and women's doubles, and mixed doubles will be contested across 10 days of competition with 5 gold, silver, and bronze medals awarded. Again, badminton is one of those sports that you probably just play in your backyard for fun during the summer holidays. but it's really hard to try to find books that focus mostly on badminton. So I decided to switch this up a little bit, and I was actually able to find a manga series and put it here in the fiction category. It's called Blue Box by Koji Mihora. And this is basically a romance manga focusing between a badminton player and a basketball player, which is going to be super cute and fun, and I can't wait to read it. And for nonfiction, if you are interested, a book that I was able to find and highly recommended, even though, again, it's kind of hard to find some books, is called Dare to be a Champion by Lee Chong Wei. And this is basically an autobiography coming from the world's best singles badminton player. So I think this book is going to be really interesting on learning more about the in-depth process of what it means to be a champion in a sport that, at least here in the United States, is usually used as like a simple pastime. I really want to know what his process was like going through and becoming an Olympic champion and becoming one of the world's best badminton players, and how exactly that plays into how your life evolves around the sport. Next sport is basketball. And basketball is going to be the first sport where I kind of combine the two major categories, as there's traditional 5-on-5 basketball and now the addition of 3v3 basketball. Basketball was invented by James W. Naismith to keep his students fit during the winter. In December 1891, the physical education teacher at the YMCA International Training School in Springfield, USA, sought a suitable indoor sport for his students, and plenty of the rules for the game he created still apply today. The first international games was played in the 1920s, and the first World Championships took place in the 1950s. Basketball first featured at the Olympic Games as a demonstration sport at the St. Louis 1904 Olympic Games, when the competition counted as an event of the American Basketball Championship. Consequently, only American teams took part. Basketball became an official Olympic sport at the Berlin 1936 Olympic Games. Women's basketball was included on the Olympic program for the first time 40 years later at the Montreal 1976 Olympic Games. Historically, the United States has been particularly dominant in the sport it invented, with the men's team bringing home Olympic gold at every Games apart from the 1972, 1980, 1988, and 2004 editions, and the women's team winning gold at every game since 1984, with the exception of Barcelona in '92 when they won bronze. The USA made its mark at the Barcelona 1992 Olympics with its dream team of NBA players who came away with the gold medal after winning each of their games by an average of 40 points.
And this varies slightly from 3x3 or 3v3 basketball, which is considered to be the #1 urban sport in the world, as 3v3 basketball has its roots in street basketball, a creative variation of the indoor game with a less formal structure. Evolving from outdoor courts to the Olympic Games, 3v3 basketball has been structured over the years by the International Basketball Federation, the FIBA, the governing body responsible for developing basketball. The introduction of the events such as 3v3 World Tour and the 3v3 Super League in France reflects the soaring popularity of this young urban sport, played in an electric atmosphere whipped up by a DJ and their music. 3v3 basketball featured at the Singapore 2010 Youth Olympic Games, in Nanjing 2014 Youth Olympic Games, and the Buenos Aires 2018 Youth Olympic Games, drawing huge crowds at all three competitions. In 2017, on the back of this young sport's resounding success, the IOC announced its decision to include 3v3 basketball as part of the Olympic program at the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games, where the first ever 3v3 Olympic titles were won. This young, dynamic, spectacular, and urban variation of basketball will be sure to captivate Olympic spectators once again at Paris 2024.
Now, basketball is a popular sport, again, not just here in the United States, but it's really started to pick up some steam internationally, and I love seeing that. I love seeing how much this sport seems to be gaining traction, especially when it comes to the NBA in particularly, when we're seeing more and more international players being the dominant forces on certain teams. So of course there's going to be a million books focusing on basketball, but the one that I wanted to highlight here for our fiction choice is called Sully by John Grisham. And this story is basically about the character of Samuel, who has the opportunity to travel from his home in South Sudan to the US for a basketball tournament, as every kid's dream would be to continue to play their sport. But while he is abroad doing this basketball tournament, a war breaks out in his home country, and now he really needs to make these decisions on what he's supposed to do about this, not just for in the present time in this tournament, but also for the future. And I think this book is really going to hit close to home, and I really think that it's going to show us what it means to try to follow your dream, but also be kind of conflicted with what is going on and what to do when your home country may need you more. And a nonfiction book, one that I've never heard of, but when I went to go put it on hold at Libby, has so many holds. Like, I have to wait for a while to be able to get this on both audiobook and ebook. And so I was really surprised that I've never heard this one, but apparently it's pretty popular. And that book is going to be There's Always This Year on Basketball and Ascension by Hanif Abdurrahman. I'm sorry if I said that wrong. But this book kept coming up and up and up and up and up again about how popular and how great this nonfiction book about basketball was. And this is basically telling the story of what it was like for this author to grow up as a basketball fan in 1990s Ohio, which is, of course, where LeBron James is from and when he really started to get his start. So I really think this is going to be interesting, especially now that it's come out that LeBron James is actually going to be the flag bearer for the opening ceremonies. So this might be a nice little look back on what it was like to grow up in the LeBron era. I'm not really sure too much about that, as I was born in the mid-90s, so I don't really have like a memory of what it was like to watch him from the beginning. But I think this book is going to be really interesting, and again, it's super popular, so hopefully I'll be able to read it during the time of the Olympics. Next sport, beach volleyball. A variation of volleyball played on sand first appeared on the beaches of Santa Monica, California in the 1920s. The first beach volleyball tournament took place in 1947, and the first circuit was launched in the 1950s, involving hundreds of players on California beaches. The first professional players union was established in the 1980s, and the first international tournament, sanctioned by the International Volleyball Federation, the FIVB, was held in 1987. Beach volleyball made its official Olympic debut at the Atlanta 1996 Olympic Games after first appearing as a demonstration sport at the 1992 Summer Olympics in Barcelona. Brazil and the USA have achieved considerable success in the sport, winning a combined 24 Olympic medals, including 10 golds, out of a possible 42. The only other NOCs to finish on top of the podium have been Germany in the men's and women's tournaments, men in London in 2012 and women in Rio 2016, Australia in the women's tournament in Sydney 2000, and Norway in the men's tournament in Tokyo 2020. Again, beach volleyball is very interesting as it's more of a derivative of what started as regular volleyball, and I think a really good fiction book that I was able to find, or I guess another manga series I was able to find, is called Beach Stars by Mashiro Morio. And that is because this manga series features a former volleyball player who has to essentially transition into playing beach volleyball because her original traditional volleyball club shut down, and so she needs that outlet, so she transitions from volleyball to beach volleyball. And then a nonfiction book, a really great one that was recommended if you're really interested in more of the history of how beach volleyball started as a sport in general, is called Kings of Summer: The Rise of Beach Volleyball by Kent Steffers and Travis Maywerder. And this is basically the real history, as these gentlemen call it, behind the sport and its initial rise to popularity for what we see it today. Again, just some fun beachy books to get you not just in that Olympic mood, but to continue the summer vibes as well. So I recommend picking those two up, as I will be doing so. Next, boxing. The exact origins of the sport of boxing are unknown, though some of the earliest evidence dating from the 3rd millennium BCE comes from Sumerian artifacts found in present-day Iraq. Boxing was introduced to the ancient Olympic Games in 688 BC, where boxers used soft leather thongs to bind their hands and forearms for protection. Boxing seemed to disappear with the fall of the Roman Empire before resurfacing in the 17th century in England, where records of amateur boxing began in 1880. Initially, 5 weight categories were contested: bantam, not exceeding 54 kilos, feather, not exceeding 57 kilos, light, not exceeding 63.5 kilos, middle, not exceeding 73 kilos, and heavy, which would be any weight. Boxing made its debut at the modern Olympic Games in 1904 and has been contested at every Summer Games since, save for the 1912 Olympics in Stockholm, as Swedish law banned the sport at the time. Women's boxing was first introduced to the Olympic program at London 2012. The USA swept the podium at the 1904 Games in St. Louis, as it was the only NOC to compete in the event. Team USA athletes have continued to achieve Olympic success in the sport, winning 117 medals, with competitors from Cuba with 78 medals and Great Britain 62 medals also performing well. One fiction book that I was able to find, as boxing is one of those sports that is popular, but sometimes it's hard to find novelizations or characters that feature boxing as an outlet or a different type of sport method to release themselves. One book that seemed really particular or interesting that I can't wait to pick up and why I'm adding it to this TBR is called The Berlin Boxing Club by Robert Chernow. And this is loosely inspired by the life of Max Schmeling, as he gives boxing lessons to a Jewish boy during the rise of Nazism in Germany. And the fact that this fiction book seems to be not only popular, but I'm really curious about what is going to go on between this relationship between coach and mentee really has me fascinated. I can't wait to read it. And a nonfiction book that sounded really interesting to me that I wanted to mention here is called Unforgivable Blackness: The Rise and Fall of Jack Johnson by Jeffrey C. Ward, which is based on the life of the first Black heavyweight champion who was the most celebrated African American of his time. And I believe this was in the early 1900s, it said. I think 1904-ish is when Jack Johnson began his rise. So with that being so early on in American history, or I guess more modern American history, I'm really curious to see exactly how his life as a Black man, a very popular Black man in a time where African Americans were still treated as less than, I'm really curious to see how his life is going to be and how he evolved from being just probably a regular boxer to this world famous athlete. Next sport we're going to focus on is breaking, also known as break dancing. Breaking is an urban dance style that originated in the United States in the 1970s. With roots in hip-hop culture, breaking first took form in the lively block parties in the Bronx borough of New York, and is characterized by acrobatic movements, stylized footwork, and the key role played by the DJ and the MC, Master of Ceremonies, during battles. International competitions were first held in the 1990s, popularizing the dance form among hip-hop communities and the general public along the way. Breaking featured at the Summer Youth Olympic Games in Buenos Aires in 2018. Following its outstanding success at the Games in Argentina, breaking was added to the Paris 2024 Olympic program as a new sport. So this is really fascinating because we're getting a brand new sport to the Olympic competition and the Olympic program. And the fact that it's breakdancing is so fascinating to me. I can't wait to watch professional breakdancers. It's up my alley. I can't wait. If you are curious about breakdancing and how it can be formed or how it can be expressed in a novelized form, a really great fiction book I've heard great things about that I actually didn't know focused on breakdancing, I just heard it was a good book overall, is called A Very Large Expanse of Sea by Tahereh Mafi. And Tahereh Mafi is known for, I believe it's the Shatter Me series, so known for doing YA dystopian series. So the fact that she is writing about a more contemporary fiction YA, which this book is, seems really fascinating to me. I haven't read Shatter Me yet, but I've heard nothing but great things about it. But this book focuses on a girl a year after the events of 9/11 and how Shirin, the character, continues to be stereotyped against as she is Muslim, but finds a way to vent her frustrations out through breakdancing. So not only is it going to be talking about the stereotypes of those who followed the events of 9/11, but also how breakdancing can be a form of expression through that performance, and that sounds really interesting to me. And then a nonfiction book, again, if you're more interested in the history of what breakdancing is Underground Dance Masters by Thomas Guzman Sanchez, who, a dancer from the 1970s, sets the record straight about the American dance style and culture. So I believe he's going to go into the depths about what really happened to create this dance style known as breaking. And again, that just sounds super interesting, and I can't wait to read these as I'm watching the first ever Olympic breakdancing. Next sport is going to be canoeing. And again, for canoeing, I decided to combine both canoe slalom and canoe sprint, as it's hard to find books that talk about each of the sports separately. Canoe slalom is going to be the first sport that we're talking about, and for centuries, canoes were used as a means of transport as well as a useful tool for hunting and fishing in North America, Siberia, and Greenland. The sport of canoe slalom was modeled from ski slalom and began in Switzerland in 1932. The first contests were performed on flat water, but were later switched to whitewater rapids. Canoe slalom made its debut at the 1972 Olympic Games in Munich and became a permanent Olympic fixture at the 1992 Olympic Games in Barcelona. Athletes from European nations have achieved enormous success in the sport at the Games, winning roughly 90% of all canoe slalom medals. And for the sport of canoe sprint, the first recorded competitive canoe sprint race took place at the British Royal Canoe Club in 1869. Canoe sprint became an Olympic medal discipline at the Berlin 1936 Olympic Games, after previously featuring as a demonstration event at the Paris 1924 Olympic Games. So again, I wanted to combine the sport of canoeing, and both of these books are more so featuring canoeing as a means of exploring nature and getting out there as well, so maybe not competitive canoeing, but still involves the act of what canoeing was really meant for in their stories. One book on the fiction side, I believe is actually more of a mystery thriller, which is super interesting, is called The River by Peter Heller. And this is about two college friends who decide to take a Canadian canoe trip, but a wildfire causes more issues than they originally thought. And again, I think, like I said, it's like a mystery thriller, and I wanted to throw one of those in here on the fiction side of things, as you may not be a general fiction kind of person, and just to mix up the genres a little bit. For nonfiction, though, I've heard nothing but great things about this book, so I'm also super excited to read it, and that is called Where the Falcon Flies: A 3,400-kilometer Odyssey from My Doorstep to the Arctic by Adam Schultz. And basically, Adam Schultz one day spotted a falcon flying in the fields, and he decided to follow its migration route on a canoe. And I think that's really fascinating, because I love the idea of just going out in nature and exploring your interests. Why does this animal do this? Where is it going? How does it go about that? And the fact that it features canoeing, I think, is also really fascinating. Next event we're going to be talking about is cycling BMX. And this is another one where it can be divided into two categories. We have cycling BMX freestyle and cycling BMX racing. Bicycle motocross, also known as BMX, freestyle was born out of the imagination of children and teenagers in California in the 1970s, who were inspired by the moves of BMX racers in the region. The sport became increasingly popular over the subsequent decades and was integrated into programs of extreme sports competitions, including the X Games in the 2000s and the FISE International Festival of Extreme Sports. The first BMX Freestyle World Cup was organized by cycling's world governing body, Union Cycliste Internationale, the UCI, in 2016 as part of that year's FISE. BMX Freestyle got its first run on the Olympic stage at the 2018 Youth Olympic Games in Buenos Aires. It offered a thrilling spectacle in front of packed crowds, convincing the International Olympic Committee of the potential of the ultimate urban sport. BMX Freestyle returns for its second Olympic Games at Paris 2024, after making its competitive debut at Tokyo 2020. There's also BMX racing, and BMX racing emerged from the motocross craze that took off in California in the 1960s, as youngsters began racing their bikes on improvised tracks all over the state. BMX began to develop into a proper sport in the early 1980s. In 1981, the International BMX Federation was founded, with the first BMX World Championships following 1 year later. BMX was integrated into the Union Cycliste Internationale, or UCI, in 1993, thereby clearing the first hurdle required to feature at the Olympic Games. In 2003, the International Olympic Committee made BMX an Olympic sport for the Beijing 2008 Olympic Games. Despite the sport's relatively short history on the Olympic stage, certain athletes have already made their presence felt at the Games. Two-time Olympic gold medalist Mariana Pajon And Tokyo 2020 champion and 2021 world champion Meek Kimmin are two of the favorites to finish on the top of the podium at Paris 2024. Now, BMX is something that I've always been familiar with. I grew up in a kind of small town where you got to ride your bikes basically everywhere. There weren't really necessarily sidewalks, but we grew up in like the fields and in the woodlands and things like that, and the pines is where I'm from. And there was definitely people who thought they could do BMX, whether that be freestyle or racing, all the time. And again, BMX was kind of hard to find novels and books about, but I was able to find this one fiction book called Shredded by Karen Avivi. This is where Josie is determined to qualify for the BMX freestyle event right before her senior year. And of course, this is going to focus on what happens during the event, what doesn't happen during the event, and basically just going on trying to achieve this dream of hers. And when it comes to nonfiction, one thing that I found really interesting about the book that I was able to get nonfiction was talking more about like the bikes themselves and how they developed over time, which I think is really fascinating and not a lot of people really dive too deep into for other sporting equipment. And that's called Rad Rides, the best BMX bikes of all time. And this is by Intercity, Gabbin and Stuart Robinson. So a few authors coming together to work on this book. And I'm just really fascinated because it's going to be an in-depth look at the history of BMX bikes and also the culture of the sport. So not only do you get the history of how BMX came to be what it is and how we know it of today, but also like you get to learn a few things about bikes. And I think that is so fun. Still in the same general umbrella as cycling is very popular, but again, kind of its own niche that I wanted to talk about is cycling, but mountain biking. Mountain bike is a relatively new sport that emerged in the 1970s when cyclists in California decided to take their bikes off-road and explore new trails. In the 1990s, the first mountain bikes that could withstand the impact of rougher terrain were created, and the hobby subsequently took off, quickly becoming a sport in its own right. The first informal competitions took place in the late 1970s before the first official world championships were held in the 1990s. Mountain bike made its Olympic debut 100 years after track cycling and road cycling at the Atlanta 1996 Olympic Games, with the individual races for men and women. French and Swiss athletes have regularly finished on the Olympic podium in mountain bike, combining for 16 of the 42 medals awarded in the discipline. Mountain biking is something that I wish I could do. I have a huge bruise on my leg just from regular biking because I fell off of it and it poked me, so I should not be anywhere near mountains while biking. But I do think that it's really fascinating that they added this specific sport of mountain biking because it is so different from regular biking on a trail or on like a road or track or anything like that, because you are using those trails. And a fiction book that really seemed to focus on mountain biking is called Switching Gears by Chantal Sedgwick. And this is after a great loss in her family, Emmy fills the void with her passion for mountain biking. So again, I think this book, kind of like some of the other ones we talked about, is going to be looking at how, actually a lot of these as women, are using the sport as an expression and an outlet for what they may be going through in life, and I'm super excited to be able to pick this up during the Olympics. And a nonfiction book, again, one that kept coming up and up because it was kind of hard to find specific mountain biking books, but I did find one called At the Edge, Riding for My Life by Danny McAskill, which is basically a biography about Danny, how he's always pushing his life to the extremes, especially when it comes to things like mountain biking, and what it's like mentally and physically to take life to the next level. So not only is this book going to be featuring mountain biking, but I also think it's going to be a good book just about facing certain aspects of your life and always making sure that you're living your life to the fullest and the best that it can be. So I'm actually really excited to pick this one up. And the last sport that I'm going to be talking about is going to be general cycling, which again can be broken up into two categories of road cycling and track cycling. Road cycling is composed of various disciplines reflecting its age-old past and modern outlook. Road cycling is the earliest form of the sport. During the 19th century, cycling enjoyed a surge in popularity thanks to the invention of the chain and gearing system. The first races were organized a few years later, with the first documented event held in 1868 in Parc des Saint-Cloud in Paris. Shortly thereafter, national cycling federations began to be established, and the International Federation, known as the Union Cycliste Internationale, was set up in 1900 to oversee the organization of various disciplines. Road cycling is one of the original Olympic events, as it featured on the competitive program at the first modern Olympiad in 1896 in Athens. However, the discipline would be left out of the next 3 Olympiads before making a return at the 1912 Olympics in Stockholm with the time trial. Women's cycling was added to the Olympic program in Los Angeles in 1984 with a road race, with the time trial added 4 years later. Prior to Atlanta 96, professional cyclists had been prohibited from competing at the Games. Today, members of the professional cycling world have been welcomed at the competition, bringing additional prestige to the Olympic races, which are now contested by the world's greatest cyclists. Track cycling also has its own unique featured sport, where the bicycles were invented in the 1950s and looked quite different to the bikes we know today. But it wasn't until the 1870s that the first competitions for cycling indoors on wooden tracks were staged, with the first 6-day race taking place in London 1878. Track cycling quickly grew in popularity and continued to develop with the creation of the International Cycling Association in 1892 and the organization of the first World Championships in Chicago in 1893. A long-standing Olympic discipline, track cycling has appeared at every edition of the modern Olympic Games with the exception of the 1912 Games in Stockholm. Women first competed in track events at the Seoul 1988 Olympic Games. Throughout the sport's 120-year Olympic history, European nations, particularly Great Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Italy, have taken the majority of medals on offer at the Games. Again, cycling is something that I think is really fascinating. Not only can you learn how to easily ride a bike at a young age, but then seeing people ride fast, honestly, it's impressive to me. And it sounds silly and stupid, but I love watching just people ride, and just the idea of just riding and focusing on nothing but the road and the bike in front of you is just, it's so nice to me in a way. I know they're doing it super, super fast, and it's not too super crazy, but I don't know, there's something about it that really appeals to me. And a fiction book that focuses on the sport of cycling that I am going to be reading that sounded fascinating to me is The Rider by Tim Crabb. And this is known as a cycling classic. So again, I didn't want to go too much into it. Same thing with the Once a Runner book, because it's just not, oh, you need to read it if you're a cyclist. Oh, it's one of the cycling greats. I'm like, okay, you've intrigued me. I'm fascinated. But it's also kind of talking about the tale of the painstaking 150-kilometer race through the lens of this amateur biker. And so I'm excited to kind of pick that up, especially since a lot of cyclists are calling it one of the classics. And a nonfiction book a lot more about general cycling compared to like BMX and compared to mountain biking, I'm going to recommend, because I'm also fascinated in it, is End to End, The Land's End to John O. Grant's Cycling Record, A Tale of Obsession, Hallucination, and Happiness by Paul Jones. And this is going to be the story of what would compel someone to ride the length of Britain against the clock. So again, just another book fascinating, be like, why is this person going to ride across Britain and like the British coast and things like that? Why is he going to do that? And again, I think it's just that fascination of just biking being all about you and focusing on just you, the road, the bike, and everything about that. So I'm curious about what those hallucination aspects are also going to be talking about. But I don't know, it just sounds fascinating to me. Alright, so that's going to be part 1 of this video. I'm going to break it up into 3 different parts, as there are a lot of sports that we need to get through. Again, some of these books I've read before, most of them I haven't, and I'm going to be reading during the Olympic Games, which is going to be super fun. I'm excited to learn more about sports I don't know about. But let me know down in the comments, what sport are you excited to see? Do any of these books seem interested to you? Or if you are an athlete in one of these sports, do you recommend a specific book, whether that be fiction or nonfiction, focusing on the sport as a whole? I'm so excited to watch the Olympics. I hope you guys are too, especially with opening ceremonies taking place today. But let me know everything that you think down in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And I'll see you next time for part 2 of my Olympic TBR.